On October 25, 1415, King Henry V of England stood in the muddy fields near Agincourt in northern France and watched death approaching. His army of 6,000 men, mostly peasant longbowmen dressed in rags, were starving, sick with dysentery, and exhausted from a 250-mile march through enemy territory. Many could barely stand. Some were dying from disease, even as they formed battle lines. Facing them across the muddy plain were at least 20,000 French soldiers, possibly 30,000, including 8,000 armored knights mounted on warhorses, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, plus thousands more dismounted men-at-arms and crossbowmen. The French outnumbered the English at least 3-1, possibly 5-1. They were fresh, well-fed, and fighting on their own soil to defend their kingdom from invasion. By every military calculation, by every rule of medieval warfare, the English army should have been annihilated before noon. Henry V should have died in the mud, his peasant archers should have been trampled by French cavalry, and England's invasion of France should have ended in complete disaster. But instead, in the next 6 hours, those 6,000 starving English soldiers would kill between 7,000 and 10,000 Frenchmen in what would become history's most famous massacre of medieval nobility, where French knights drowned in their own armor in knee-deep mud, where English peasant archers became executioners of the aristocracy, and where the course of the 100 Years' War was changed forever by reign to reign and French tactical stupidity so profound it still defies comprehension 6 centuries later. To understand the absolute impossibility of what happened at Agincourt, you must understand how desperate the English situation was in October 1415. Henry V had invaded France in August with roughly 12,000 men, besieging and capturing the port city of Harfleur after a brutal 5-week siege that cost him thousands of soldiers to dysentery, the medieval killer that slaughtered armies without a battle. By the time Harfleur fell in September, Henry had lost a third of his army to disease and had to garrison the captured city with another 1,500 men. He was left with roughly 6,000 effective soldiers, and all military logic said he should sail back to England immediately. Winter was approaching. The French were assembling armies. Continuing the campaign was suicide. But Henry V was 28 years old, ambitious, and determined to prove himself the greatest warrior king since Edward III. He made a decision that was either brilliantly calculated or completely insane. He would march his tiny, sick army across 250 miles of French territory to the English-held port of Calais, essentially a military parade demonstrating English power. If the French didn't interfere, Henry would reach Calais and sail home claiming moral victory. If the French attacked his small force, he was gambling they would be too disorganized or too cowardly to fight effectively. It was a massive gamble, and the French called his bluff. The march to Calais became a nightmare. The English army covered roughly 15 miles per day, moving through hostile territory, where French forces shadowed them constantly but refused to attack, waiting for the main French army to assemble. The English soldiers were already weakened by dysentery from the siege of Harfleur. The disease causes severe dehydration, abdominal pain, and bloody diarrhea. Men suffering from dysentery can barely walk, let alone fight. Contemporary chronicles describe English soldiers cutting holes in their trousers so they could relieve themselves while marching without stopping. Some marched barefoot because they had sold their boots for food. They were starving because the French had destroyed crops and livestock in their path, implementing a scorched earth policy. The English lived on whatever they could forage: nuts, berries, occasional stolen livestock. Many men were literally dying as they walked. Henry V tried to reach Calais quickly by crossing the Somme River at a ford, but found every crossing heavily guarded or destroyed by the French. He was forced to march upstream for days, searching for an undefended ford, adding dozens of miles to the journey, while his army grew weaker. Finally, on October 19th, the English found an unguarded ford and crossed, but the delay had allowed the French army to position itself directly between Henry's force and Calais. On October 24th, English scouts reported that a massive French army, possibly 25,000 to 30,000 strong, was blocking the road ahead near the village of Agincourt. Henry had no choice but to fight. The French army that assembled at Agincourt represented the military power of the richest kingdom in Western Europe. Medieval France had perhaps 15 million people compared to England's 3 million and could field proportionally larger armies with better equipment. The French force included the Constable Charles d'Albret, the highest military officer in France, the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon and Bar, and hundreds of counts, barons and knights who had brought their own retinues of soldiers. This was the cream of French nobility, men who had trained for war since childhood, who viewed combat as their sacred duty and greatest honor. The core of the army was heavy cavalry, approximately 8,000 armored knights on warhorses, wearing full-plate armor that could weigh 60 to 80 pounds, but made them nearly invulnerable to most weapons. These knights carried 12-foot lances for charging, then switched to swords, axes, or warhammers for close combat. Supporting the cavalry were thousands of dismounted men-at-arms, essentially knights fighting on foot, wearing the same heavy armor but using pole-axes and swords. The French also had several thousand crossbowmen, professional soldiers who could shoot bolts that penetrated armor at medium range. In theory, this army was unstoppable. In practice, it suffered from 3 fatal weaknesses that would destroy it: overconfidence bordering on arrogance, internal competition for glory among the nobility, and catastrophically poor leadership that ignored terrain and tactics. The battlefield at Agincourt was a narrow corridor between 2 woods, the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt, perhaps 900 to 1,200 yards wide. Henry V positioned his army at the northern end of this corridor with woods protecting both flanks, making it impossible for the French to outflank him. His 6,000 men formed a single line with about 900 men-at-arms in the center, heavily armored soldiers who could hold against French infantry, and approximately 5,000 longbowmen on both wings. The English longbowmen were not professional soldiers. They were yeomen, peasant farmers and townsmen who practiced archery because English law required it. Every able-bodied man had to train with the longbow from childhood. These men were not wealthy enough to afford armor beyond simple leather jerkins or padded jackets. Many were barefoot, sick and starving, but they were carrying the most devastating weapon in medieval warfare, the English longbow. A trained longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute accurately at ranges up to 250 yards. The arrows had bodkin points, narrow steel tips designed to penetrate chainmail, and even plate armor at close range. When 5,000 longbowmen shot simultaneously, they could darken the sky with arrows. Contemporary chronicles describe the sound as like thunder or hail on roofs. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. Horses hit by multiple arrows would panic and refuse to charge. Men would cower behind shields. The longbow had revolutionized warfare, and the French had never developed an effective counter. The terrain at Agincourt had one other critical feature that would prove decisive: mud. It had rained heavily in the days before October 25th. The field between the armies was freshly plowed farmland that had been trampled by thousands of troops and turned into a quagmire. Contemporary sources describe mud that was ankle to knee-deep across the entire battlefield. This was disastrous for heavy cavalry because warhorses sank into mud, losing speed and maneuverability. It was even worse for dismounted knights in full-plate armor who had to walk through mud that sucked at their feet with every step, exhausting them before combat even began. The English, positioned on slightly higher ground, could stand in place and shoot. The French, positioned on lower ground, would have to advance uphill through mud under arrow fire. Henry V recognized these advantages immediately. The French commanders either didn't understand the tactical situation or didn't care because their battle plan was essentially charge the English with overwhelming numbers and win through superiority. It was not a plan, it was an assumption, and it would kill thousands of France's nobility. The battle began around 11 a.m. on October 25, 1415, after a strange delay where both armies stood watching each other for hours. The French refused to attack first, believing that advancing through mud toward an enemy on higher ground was disadvantageous. The English couldn't attack because they were too weak and outnumbered. Finally, Henry V ordered his army to advance toward the French, a move that seemed suicidal but was calculated. The English archers had spent the morning hammering sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of their positions, angled toward the enemy. These stakes were about 6 feet long with fire-hardened points, designed to impale charging horses. When Henry ordered the advance, the archers pulled up their stakes, marched forward several hundred yards closer to the French, and replanted the stakes. They then began shooting at the French army, deliberately provoking them into attacking. The French cavalry, enraged by being shot at by peasant commoners, did exactly what Henry wanted. They charged. Approximately 1,000 to 1,500 French knights on warhorses, carrying lances, thundered toward the English lines, intending to smash the archers, and then roll up the English men-at-arms from the flanks. It should have worked. Heavy cavalry charges were nearly unstoppable in medieval warfare when executed properly. But nothing about Agincourt went properly for the French. The cavalry charge became a disaster before it reached the English lines. The horses were running through ankle-deep mud, slowing them from the gallop needed for effective impact to barely faster than a trot. As they approached the English archers, they encountered the field of sharpened stakes. Horses instinctively refused to impale themselves on obstacles. They tried to stop or swerve, creating chaos in the charging formations. Meanwhile, 5,000 English longbowmen were shooting arrows as fast as they could reload. Contemporary estimates suggest that in the first minute of French cavalry approaching, 25,000 to 30,000 arrows were fired at them. Horses were hit by multiple arrows simultaneously. Some collapsed, others panicked and threw their riders. Others turned and ran back toward their own lines, crashing into the second wave of cavalry still advancing. The few French knights who reached the English stakes found themselves unable to penetrate the barrier. English archers, using hammers, axes, and swords, pulled surviving knights from horses and killed them. The entire cavalry charge, which should have shattered the English wings, achieved nothing except creating a panicked mass of wounded horses and dismounted knights churning the battlefield into even deeper mud. Worse, the fleeing cavalry crashed into the main body of French dismounted men-at-arms who were advancing on foot toward the English centre. Thousands of heavily armoured French knights, already exhausted from walking through knee-deep mud in 80 pounds of armour, were knocked down or thrown into further confusion by their own retreating cavalry. The French attack lost all cohesion before it even engaged the English. The main French assault, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 dismounted men-at-arms, continued advancing through the mud toward the English centre. These were not cowards. These were some of the bravest men in France, knights who had sworn oaths to fight for their king and their honour, who believed that death in battle was preferable to retreat. But courage cannot overcome catastrophic tactical disadvantages. The French were walking uphill through knee-deep mud, wearing full-plate armour, carrying heavy weapons, under continuous arrow fire from 5,000 longbowmen. Every step required enormous effort. The mud sucked at their feet. Men were collapsing from exhaustion before reaching the English lines. Those who fell couldn't get up quickly because of their armour's weight and the mud's suction. Men fell on top of other fallen men, creating piles of bodies. The English archers continued shooting directly into the packed French formations from close range, perhaps 50 to 100 yards. At this distance, bodkin point arrows could penetrate even plate armour. Men were hit multiple times. The narrow battlefield funneled the French into an increasingly tight mass, where thousands of men were packed so closely they couldn't use their weapons effectively. When the French vanguard finally reached the English men-at-arms, they were so exhausted and disorganized that the impact was negligible. The English line held. What followed was one of medieval warfare's most horrific scenes, a grinding melee in knee-deep mud, where exhausted French knights fought desperately while English soldiers and archers systematically killed them. The French were so densely packed that men in the rear ranks couldn't fight, couldn't even raise their weapons, but couldn't retreat because more French were pushing forward from behind. Men were suffocating in the crush. Others were falling in the mud and being trampled by their own comrades. The weight of falling bodies created piles of armoured men, 3 or 4 bodies high. Knights at the bottom of these piles, wounded or simply knocked down, drowned in mud and blood, suffocated by the weight of corpses on top of them, unable to move in their heavy armour. This was not glorious combat. This was industrial slaughter, where French nobility died like animals in a slaughterhouse. English men-at-arms fought with axes and hammers, striking at any French knight they could reach. English archers, their arrows exhausted, dropped their bows and grabbed hammers, swords, or any weapon they could find. They pulled French knights out of the crush, forced them to the ground, and killed them by stabbing through armor gaps or simply beating them to death. Some archers used lead mallets, hammers specifically designed to crush helmets and the skulls inside them. The killing went on for hours. The second and third waves of French attacks fared no better than the first. Each wave had to advance through the same mud, now made worse by thousands of bodies, wounded horses, discarded weapons, and blood turning the ground into an even more treacherous morass. Each wave was depleted by arrow fire before reaching the English, then fell into the same exhausted, disorganized melee. The French cavalry attempted another charge and was again stopped by stakes and arrows. By early afternoon, the French attack had completely collapsed. Thousands of French soldiers were fleeing the battlefield. The ground in front of the English lines was carpeted with dead and dying Frenchmen, piled so high in places that bodies blocked further advance. English soldiers walked across corpse bridges to reach wounded French knights and finish them or take them prisoner for ransom. The battle should have been over. But then Henry V made a decision that remains controversial 6 centuries later. He ordered the massacre of French prisoners. Contemporary accounts claim Henry ordered prisoners killed because he feared a French counterattack from forces still on the field and needed his soldiers ready to fight rather than guarding captives. Another version suggests he saw French forces moving in the rear and thought they were preparing to attack the English baggage train. Whatever the reason, Henry ordered his men to kill the prisoners. English soldiers who had spent hours capturing French knights for ransom, which was the primary way common soldiers became wealthy in medieval warfare, were now ordered to murder their captives. Many refused initially because killing prisoners violated the codes of chivalry and cost them potential fortunes. Henry reportedly threatened to hang any soldier who disobeyed. The massacre was carried out by a specially designated unit, possibly 200 men, who went through the prisoners, systematically killing them. Methods included cutting throats, stabbing through armor gaps, or simply hitting them with hammers until they stopped moving. Contemporary sources suggest 1,500 to 2,000 French prisoners were killed, though numbers vary widely. Many were wounded men who couldn't defend themselves. The massacre was pragmatic from a military standpoint, eliminating potential threats, but it was also a war crime by the standards of medieval chivalry and shocked contemporaries on both sides. French chroniclers used it as evidence of English barbarism. English chroniclers defended it as military necessity. The truth is it was mass murder, and like most mass murders in history, it was justified by the perpetrators as necessary and condemned by victims as evil. By late afternoon, the Battle of Agincourt was over. The French had lost between 7,000 and 10,000 soldiers killed, including approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men-at-arms and knights, the military nobility of France. The dead included the Constable d'Albret, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, and hundreds of counts and barons whose names filled pages of chronicles. The English had lost approximately 400 to 600 soldiers, most of them men-at-arms killed in the initial melee, with very few longbowmen dead because they had fought from behind the protection of stakes. The casualty ratio was 15-1 or higher, one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Henry V had gambled everything on forcing the French to fight in terrain that favored English longbowmen, and the French had obliged by attacking directly into his strength. English longbows had destroyed French cavalry. English stakes had channeled French attacks into killing zones. English terrain advantage had exhausted French knights before combat began, and French overconfidence, poor leadership, and internal competition for glory had prevented any coordinated tactical response. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Thousands of corpses in expensive armor, many drowned in mud, piled in heaps, stripped by looters, rotting where they fell. The strategic consequences of Agincourt were immediate and lasting. France's military nobility had been devastated. Many of the dead were not just soldiers, but political leaders whose deaths created power vacuums in their regions. The psychological impact was even greater. Agincourt proved that English longbowmen could defeat French heavy cavalry, that peasant archers could kill armored nobles, that all the wealth and training and noble blood in the world couldn't overcome tactical stupidity and bad terrain. The battle traumatized France, and emboldened England. Over the next 5 years, Henry V would conquer Normandy, capturing castle after castle, town after town, until France was forced to accept the humiliating Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which made Henry heir to the French throne. Agincourt made this possible by destroying the French army and French confidence, but the long-term impact was more complex. Henry V died in 1422, just 7 years after Agincourt, from dysentery, the same disease that had nearly destroyed his army before the battle. His infant son Henry VI inherited claims to both the English and French thrones, but lacked his father's military genius. Over the following decades, inspired by Joan of Arc and equipped with gunpowder artillery, France would gradually reconquer its territory. By 1453, England had lost everything except Calais. Agincourt won a battle and changed a generation, but it couldn't win the 100 Years' War. The human cost of Agincourt, like all medieval battles, was measured not just in noble casualties but in the anonymous thousands who died for causes they barely understood. The 7,000 to 10,000 French dead included knights whose names we know from chronicles, but also thousands of common soldiers, servants and camp followers whose names were never recorded. They died in mud, suffocated under corpses, killed by arrows shot by men they had never met, for a war that would continue for decades after their deaths. The 400 to 600 English dead included peasant archers who had survived dysentery, starvation, and a 250-mile march only to die in the brief minutes of actual combat. They were celebrated as heroes in England, but their families received no compensation, no pensions, nothing but the knowledge that their sons or fathers or brothers died fighting for the king. The wounded from both sides, possibly thousands more, died slowly over days or weeks from infections in an age before antibiotics. Medieval battle wounds were almost always fatal if they broke the skin because bacteria from mud, feces, and decomposing bodies infected every injury. The survivors carried psychological trauma that no one understood or treated. They had nightmares of drowning men and piles of corpses for the rest of their lives. The mythology that developed around Agincourt transformed it from a battle into a legend, particularly in English culture. William Shakespeare's play Henry V, written in 1599, created the image of the noble warrior king giving the St. Crispin's Day speech, declaring that those who fought at Agincourt would be remembered as a band of brothers. This romantic version, with its emphasis on English valor and French cowardice, became the standard narrative. But the reality was more complex and far uglier. The English won because of tactical advantages, superior weapons technology, French mistakes, and blind luck with the terrain and weather. The massacre of prisoners violated the supposed codes of chivalry both sides claimed to uphold. The battle was not glorious. It was horrific, a muddy slaughter where thousands of men died in confusion and terror, where French nobles drowned in their own armor, where English peasants became mass killers, and where Henry V's calculated gamble paid off at a cost in human suffering that no chronicle adequately captures. On October 25, 1415, 6,000 starving English soldiers slaughtered 20,000 French nobles, not through superior courage or divine favor, but through longbows, mud, wooden stakes, and French tactical incompetence so profound that 6 centuries later, we still struggle to understand how the finest army in Europe walked directly into an obvious killing ground and died there by the thousands.